Gentlemen, comrades, thank you for coming tonight. It's an inspirational venue, so thanks to Gary for giving us this facility, and thanks to Craig for doing the technical stuff which I can't do. I intend to talk about the Clarion movement, and the main thing I will be talking about is the National Clarion Cycling Club, because it's from the Clarion Cycling Club that the wider Clarion movement actually grew. And it was a movement that reached its peak in 1914, so just over 100 years ago. And we'll come to the significance of 1914 later on. The Clarion movement takes its name from the Clarion newspaper. And the Clarion movement still exists today in the form of Clarion cycling clubs and Clarion choirs.
You want a slide, Charles?
So we can see our first slide. And, that's not me, thank God. That's Robert Blatchford, and without Robert Blatchford there would have been no Clarion newspaper. Without the newspaper there would have been no Clarion cycling club, and without the cycling club there would have been no Clarion movement that grew from the Clarion cycling club. The Clarion movement became the largest mass movement in Britain since the Chartists, and certainly at the beginning of the century its membership was larger than any political party. There were only trade unions had a bigger membership than the Clarion movement. Tom Groom, who founded the Clarion Cycling Club, and he was the first secretary of the Clarion Cycling Club, in 1944 wrote this in the Jubilee handbook. The old hands who have been through the early struggles must be permitted to give their thanks to those who first found their enthusiasm in the cause of socialism, and the man they will best remember is Robert Blatchford. Robert Blatchford was born in 1851. He had a variety of jobs, including a spell in the British Army. When he left the army, he secured a well-paid job as a journalist for a newspaper called Bell's Life, which was a London-based newspaper. And he adopted the pen name Namquam Dormii, I never sleep. He then moved to Manchester to work for the Sunday Chronicle, and he made his reputation and gained a very large following because he wrote passionately about the appalling living conditions in Manchester. The newspaper's owner, a man called Edward Holton, was extremely pleased with the increase in the circulation of the newspaper that Blatchford was generating. But Holton became increasingly concerned by the socialism that Blatchford was advocating. And this came to a head. The two of them had an argument, and basically Blatchford walked out. He said, "You won't have socialism in your newspaper, and I won't write about anything else," and that was the end of the partnership. And he walked out of an extremely well-paid job at the time. And having lost that job, he decided he would start his own socialist newspaper in a small office in Manchester. And in December 1891, the first issue of a penny weekly called the Clarion was born. And we have a picture of the first one. It's actually quite a rare picture, this is the first one, because what they did, they had it printed on quite cheap quality newsprint, and when it rained, all the ink ran. So not many of the original copies actually survived because of the Manchester weather. And because Blatchford was a very well-established writer and had a large following, the first edition sold 40,000 copies, which was quite a huge number in Manchester at that time, because it didn't actually have a national circulation. The newspaper's tone was set right from the start, and this is what Blatchford wrote. "The Clarion is a paper meant by its owners and writers to tell the truth as they see it, frankly and without fear. The Clarion may not always be right, but it will always be sincere." Its staff, and there were 6 of them, I think we might have a picture of the staff, Craig, that's the 4 of the 6 anyway. It doesn't been photoshopped. "The staff do not claim to be wise or witty, but they do claim to be honest. They do not write for faction, but for the people. They do not fight for victory, but for the truth. They do not seek to dazzle, but to please. Not to anger, but to convince. Wherever wrong exists, they will try to expose it. Towards baseness, cowardness, self-seeking or roguery, no matter where or in what class it may appear, they will show no mercy. The policy of the Clarion is a policy of humanity, a policy not of party, sect or creed, but of justice, reason and mercy. Blatchford's gift was that he was able to write very movingly about injustice and the inequality, and he was able to present socialism in a very easy to follow, clear way. At the time, many socialist journals were very eyebrow and quite difficult to follow, and particularly the Journal of the Social Democratic Federation. So, the paper's leading writers all adopted nicknames and were all seen as family friends. Can we see it on the slide, please? And they all had nicknames, and when the newspaper arrived, it was almost like a friend was coming to the living room speaking to you. They wrote in a very witty, very easy to understand manner. And Edward Fry, a man called the Bounder, was probably the most favourite one of all these journalists. He was a very, very tall man, very big man, and in fact, a new verb became to bounderise. Meant that you went into a pub or restaurant, you ate a lot of food and a lot of drink, walked out on your heels, and that's what bounderising was. And that was named after Edward Fry, and that became a Clarion tradition. These Clarion, first Clarion members, they were Clarion Christian socialists. They believed that the infant socialist movement could be a driving force to create God's kingdom here on earth. They weren't interested in an heavenly kingdom. They were living now. They wanted the kingdom now. And when Clarion Cyclists talk about the principles of socialism, what they're basically talking about are the Socialist 10 Commandments. There's a copy on the wall, and I think there's perhaps a copy here as well, right over here. Could we do a picture? Talking about the principles of socialism, we're actually talking about these 10 Commandments. And these were taught in the socialist Sunday schools. And these simple principles, people in the Clarion movement believed would lead to the formation of a new society. A society with justice as its foundation and love as its law, if we follow these 10 Commandments. You will notice there's an absence of God in these commandments, and they're also not gender neutral. They do refer to men, there's no mention of women in them. Now, quite interestingly, I'm from Bolton Socialist Club, and in Bolton Socialist Club in 1913, a woman called Sarah Reddish actually rewrote these to make them gender neutral in 1913. So she's like a century ahead of her time. So where it says all men, she put all citizens. Where it says fatherland, she put nation. So that was 1913. So Sarah Reddish was a very inspirational woman. Tom Groom, who founded the Clarion Cycling Club, he was the secretary of Bond Street Labour Church in Birmingham. He was also a member of the Social Democratic Federation, which is a Marxist organisation. And he called a meeting in Birmingham to see how they could combine the principles of socialism with cycling, because he was a cyclist. And they met in Birmingham at the Labour Church and agreed they would form a socialist cycling club. And this was in 1894. They agreed to form a socialist cycling club, and at the second meeting they actually changed its name to the Clarion Cycling Club, naming it after their favourite newspaper. The Labour Church, which Tom Groom was a member of, and these other 5 chaps were members of, they were members of the Labour Church. The Labour Church was a movement founded in 1891 by a man called John Trevor. And it was established in response to ministers in the established church who would not give facilities to socialist speakers. At the time, socialists were beginning to campaign at elections, not parliamentary elections, but elections for school boards and poor law guardians. And ministers in the established church tended to favour the Liberals or the Tories and refused to give facility to socialist speakers. And the Labour Church was a response to that. John Trevor urged his congregation to see the Labour movement, the wider Labour movement, as a religious movement. So he was linking religion and socialism together. The church, it really sprang from a non-conformist tradition that recognised injustice and demanded to know more about what was happening. They wanted people to know about their place in society, and they wanted to know about it now. They didn't want to wait for their reward in heaven. And John Trevor's message is a clear socialist message. It's not a communist message, it's a clear socialist message. The first Labour Church service was held in Manchester, in Chorlton, in Manchester, in October 1891. A string band opened the proceedings. John Trevor said some prayers. There was rousing songs were sung, including the socialist anthem, England Arise. I'm not going to sing it, but England Arise, the long, long night is over. Born in the east, behold the dawn appears. Out of your evil dream of toil and sorrow, arise, O England, for the day is here. From your fields and hills, hark the answer swells. Arise, O England, for the day is here. That was the hymn of the socialist movement. It is still the hymn of the Clarion Cycling Club today. John Trevor then delivered a sermon where he spoke about the need to bring the religious dimension into the struggle for the liberation of the workers. The following Sunday, Robert Blatchford attended, and these folk, over 4,000 people turned up, more than could fit in the town hall. They spilt outside. From that point, the movement spread through Lancashire, Yorkshire, the industrial Midlands, the potteries, South Wales, parts of Scotland. Some Labour churches were formed in a direct response to churches promoting liberal views, churches supporting the establishment. And these churches were not going to support the establishment, they were going to call the establishment into question. By 1893, that's just 2 years, they were attracting up to 500 members at each service. So they were attracting more members than most parish churches, in fact. And his Labour Church was based upon 5 principles. And I'll not go through all the principles, but they were mainly about being inclusive. They were about including everybody. No matter what religious sect you belong to, you were welcome. No matter what class you belong to, you were welcome. Providing you came along and you were prepared to listen to the socialist message and challenge the established rule. The socialist Sunday school movement was similar, but obviously aimed at children. And the socialist Sunday school movement developed separate from the Labour Church, but in fact Labour Church, and virtually every Labour church would have had a socialist Sunday school. But also some other institutions did as well. And the socialist Sunday school movement, from where these commandments come, can be traced back to the London dock strike of 1892. A woman called Mary Gray from Battersea organised a soup kitchen for children strikers, but found most of them hadn't actually any education neither, even though by that time education was more or less compulsory, enforcing it was a vastly different matter. So she set about teaching children not about the Bible and about God, but teaching children about the causes of poverty, because they were enduring poverty, which is why they were starving. It wasn't that their parents were lazy, it was the consequence of the capitalist system. The movement soon spread, and by 1912 there were 120 socialist Sunday schools spread throughout Britain. They were particularly strong in the north, in London and in Glasgow. The children were taught socialism and encouraged to join the broader Labour movement and fight for a fairer society. Many people who later went on to become important figures in the Labour movement and the trade union movement learned their socialism in the socialist Sunday schools. That was the seed that was planted. And the Socialist Sunday schools, it lasted basically up until about to the 1920s. The last one actually didn't close until the 1970s, but by the 1920s the movement was actually in decline. Turning back to Birmingham and the Clarion Cycling Club, in Easter 1894, 7 members of this newly formed club set out on the first annual Easter tour. And those Easter tours still exist today. The Clarion Cycling Club still does have an annual Easter tour, or an Easter meet to be more exact. For the first Easter tour, they took the train from Birmingham to Wolverhampton to get them out to the industrial site of Birmingham. Took the train to Wolverhampton, they then rode to Northbridge. Following day, Easter Saturday, down to Beardsley, and then on Sunday they headed back to Birmingham to do a service at the Lady Church. What Tom Groom did, he then wrote about this ride in the Clarion newspaper, and the effect was astounding. Readers of the Clarion newspaper Sunday all over the country said, why don't we form a Clarion Cycling Club? So he hadn't started a national club, but he had started what rapidly became a national movement. And in the first year, by the end of 1894, there were Clarion clubs in the Potteries, Liverpool, Bradford, Barnsley, and 1995 others quickly followed. I think there's a picture of Blackburn Clarion, I think. Oh, that's a Socialist Sunday School walk, is that? Those are the founders going on their first Easter tour, in fact. Tom Groom. That's Blackburn Clarion in 1890. And so these clubs, they sprang up as completely separate entities. They weren't linked to Tom Groom, they weren't linked to the newspaper, but they read about Tom Groom in the newspaper, and they were completely independent entities. Because of the rapid spread of it, and because it was being reported in the newspaper, Tom Groom arranged an Easter meet in Ashbourne in 1895. Some 200 cyclists turned up, and at this meet the National Clarion Cycling Club was formed. And from that National Clarion Cycling Club, the wider movement grew. At Ashbourne, the club badge was adopted. I think we have a picture of the club badge, which they still wear today. The club motto, Fellowship is Life, was adopted, and the club greeting, Boots, was adopted. The response to Boots is Spurs. So when somebody shouted out Boots, you shouted out Spurs. And again, that still happens today in the Clarion Cycling Club. You walk in a cafe, you shout Boots, and if there's a member of the Clarion Club there, they will or should shout Spurs. There's a very brief annual conference held in Ashbourne. They elected a subcommittee of 3 to draw up some rules. It was agreed that non-socialists could join the club. It was also agreed that women could join the club. Now that was really very, very radical in 1895. Most cyclist clubs did not have women in 1895. Some of them didn't have women in 1955. Duckenfield, for example, being an example of that. This committee actually met once and reported they'd done naught, and they were immediately re-elected for another year. So people were obviously quite pleased with the committee they'd elected. The club greeting of Boots and its response Spurs came about because as night was falling in Ashbourne, cyclists were arriving and people couldn't tell whether they were coming to the club meet or whether they were just ordinary cyclists. And some bright spark decided if they shouted out Boots, if the person was in the Clarion Club, there would be a reader of the Clarion newspaper and would respond by shouting Spurs. They could then be directed to their lodgings for the night. Why would they know that? Because in the Clarion newspaper, Robert Blatchford had written about when he was in the army. In the barracks at night, when the lights were put out, some soldier would be asked to tell a tale, called spin or cuffer, the cuffer being an army slang for a tale. Some soldier would be asked to tell a cuffer, but because lights were out, you weren't aware who was listening or who was asleep. So every so often through the story, irrespective of what the story was, you would inject the word boots. And at that moment, everybody had to shout Spurs. So it followed that if you read the Clarion newspaper, you knew about the story. Therefore, when somebody sat on the wall at Ashmore and shouted boots, you knew to respond with Spurs. Throughout the early years of the 20th century, the club continued to grow. And in 1903 in fact, when a conference was called to set up the Labour Representation Committee, that later became the Labour Party, the largest organisation outside the trade unions that attended that conference was the Clarion Cycling Club. Much larger than the Fabians or the Social Democratic Federation or the British Socialist Party. The Clarion was a much larger organisation. The largest attended Easter meet was at Chester in 1910, when 1,350 people attended the meet, all cycling from different parts of the country. At the Buxton Easter meet in 1912, a motion was carried, and it seems silly this, but it's carried in all seriousness. The motion stated, the National Club has a sound constitution and is prepared to form a cabinet to run the country when called upon to do so. And this was a cycling club, and they weren't actually joking, they were being quite serious about this. 1913, membership reached its peak of about 7,000 members. And 1914 was really the height of its popularity and influence. Sadly, after the Easter meet in 1914, within a few months, the Great Imperialist War broke out, and it all but destroyed the Clarion movement. Not so much because of the number of men who went and fell on the Western Front, but because Robert Blatchford supported the war and used his newspaper to promote the war. And this split the Clarion movement completely. The newspaper now preached hatred of the Germans. Good fellowship, works of the world unite, were now forgotten and meaningless. The paper scorned anybody who followed what Blatchford had been advocating for years: internationalism, brotherhood, solidarity. And he suddenly changed, horses completely. He was going in the wrong direction. He'd been teaching people for years to think for themselves, but now he didn't want them to think for themselves. He wanted them to follow Sergeant William Bailey and march behind a recruiting drum and go to war. The idea of killing other people didn't square with what he'd been taught. He'd been preaching a socialism that united people. The German work was your brother, he wasn't your enemy. It was works of the world unite. But suddenly he was your enemy. And overnight, the circulation of the newspaper fell from 60,000 to 10,000 virtually overnight. Blatchford's pitch was taken down in clubhouses and in Labour churches because he was seen as a bad guy, really. And the paper finally ceased publication. It went down and down and down. It eventually became a monthly newspaper. It changed its name, but in 1934 it went out of existence altogether. One important aspect of the early Clarion cycling clubs was the formation of the Clarion Scouts. What the Clarion Scouts were, they were the political activists. And these people used their bicycles to spread the word of socialism through the villages. They would cycle out into the country, giving out leaflets, giving out political tracts, sticking labels on the flanks of cows, which made them very unpopular in some places, sticking labels anywhere they could. And in Bradford, they were very politically active. They helped to distribute election leaflets, they supported socialist candidates, Their work for propaganda was enthusiastically done, and Blatchford actually wrote articles instructing them how to go from house to house, how to distribute tracts, how to sell his book, a penny book called Merry England. And it sold over 2 million copies. And it said that for every person converted to socialism by Karl Marx, 100 people were converted through Merry England. What Merry England wasn't a heavy political tome like Karl Marx. It was a series of letters to an imaginary worker in Oldham, a man called John Smith of Oldham, a man who was very keen on facts and was very fond of facts. And these letters were a series of letters to John Smith pointing out that what he took as fact was actually not fact at all. And it was a very easy to read. And he issued the book as a penny weekly. And it became a great key propaganda tool for the Clarion. There was a song, and I'm not going to sing it, but the chorus was, "Hurrah for the Clarion Scout, hail him with strenuous shout, as bold as Lysander, to push propaganda, hurrah for the Clarion Scout." And that's what they were. They were the political wing of the Clarion Cycling Club. A key role of the Clarion Scouts was to support the speakers on the Clarion vans. I think we might have a picture of Clarion van. Clarion vans were the idea of a lady called Julia Dawson. Do you have pictures of Julia Dawson? She was the editor of the letters page in the Clarion newspaper, and the Clarion vans were her idea. What she proposed was that these Clarion vans would tour the countryside with women speakers preaching socialism. And in 1896, she proposed a 13-week tour of a Clarion van. Horse-drawn van. I think you might have a picture of one. This was a typical Clarion van, horse-drawn van, and what it did, it went from village to village to village, spreading socialist propaganda. But the Clarion Cycling Club rode out before the van to announce that the van was coming. They would then generate a crowd on the village green or in the market square, and they would also be there if there was any trouble to do any, to sort out any rowdies or trouble. And the speakers were virtually always women. People like Caroline Martin, Sarah Reddish, that's what they were. And they were very, very successful. And they lasted right until about 1927 was the last one. I think this is a picture of Sarah Reddish from the Socialist Club in Bolton, a very influential figure at that time. Caroline Martin, who died in Dundee, was probably the most famous socialist at the time, even though Keir Hardie gets all the credit. Caroline Martin was far, far better known and far more popular than Keir Hardie. And if you read about Caroline Martin, her tour programme in 1890 was unbelievable. She was like speaking at 10 meetings a day, spread all over the country. How she managed to travel to these places is remarkable. But what they did, they gave an introduction to women and some men. They gave them an introduction to public speaking and to devoting their lives to the struggle of socialism. The last tour was 1929. The Clarion Cycling Club is also responsible for setting up Clarion clubhouses. This was 30 years before the first youth hostel. First youth hostel was in 1927. The idea of a residential country clubhouse grew out of a camp in Knutsford, organised by a member of Manchester Clarion called Charlie Reekie. And he was inspired by William Morris's book, which spoke in a book called News for Nowhere, where William Morris talks about an imaginary clubhouse in the country for socialists, a country haven for socialists. And William Reekie was inspired by this, and as a result of this camp, he decided the Clarion would have a clubhouse as well. So what he did, he set up a company, the Clarion Cycle Clubhouse Company, selling shares at 5 shillings. And with that money, they rented a house in Cheshire, at Bucklow Hill in Cheshire, for refreshment, recreation and accommodation for Clarion cyclists at a reasonable cost. And that set a pattern that many others followed. I think we might have a picture of that. That's Hansford Clarion Clubhouse. And what they were, that's the Sheffield one at Dormoor. What Clarion clubhouses were, they varied enormously. Some of them, most of them in fact, were rented property. They would rent a premise on a short-term lease. And some lasted for only 12 months, some lasted for a few years, some actually lasted for over 100 years. One or two were purpose-built. The Sheffield one was purpose-built. What the Sheffield one was, it was a small stone structure. There was also a massive 2-storey wooden dormitory and the camping field. The wooden dormitory burnt down. That is actually still there today. It's now a private house, in fact, but it is still there. So, the Clarion clubhouses, a limited number of them did provide overnight accommodation. Most of them didn't, in actual fact. They were just somewhere to meet. Colin Coates, a member of Clarion in 1912, talking about the Hansford Clubhouse south of Manchester, the clubhouse became a pivotal centre. No matter where our wheels led us during the day, always they would turn towards Hansford by evening. Clubhouse fatigue became the call, and that was fairly typical. Most clubs would support the clubhouse. What would happen? They'd go out on the bike ride, the wives, the children, the grandparents would walk to the clubhouse and they'd just socialise at the clubhouse all day, and the cyclists would arrive there in the evening to end the day. The last true Clarion clubhouse, and I'll come to Nelson in a moment, because Nelson Clarion is not actually a Clarion cycle clubhouse. I'll come back to that. The last Clarion clubhouse was in Warfield at Menston, belonged to the Yorkshire Clarion Cycling Club, and that closed in 2010 after 108 years. So that was one which had survived the test of time. As well as the clubhouses, there were Clarion Ramblers, and there were many Clarion rambling clubs. But unlike the cycling club, they didn't have a national structure. The most famous rambling club was the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers. They were founded by a man called Bert Ward. And Bert Ward, he produced a small handbook, and you can pick these up at car boot sales and that kind of thing. They are worth picking up if you see one. They're not worth a great deal of money. If you get the entire set, they're probably worth several £1,000. But individually, if you were paying £2 or £3, it's worth buying. What they do, they have quite a lot of information in them about walks, ramble routes, about history, about geology, about geography, and everyone is quite different. Now, the Clarion Cycle Club also produced handbooks like this. The Clarion Cycle Club ones are nowhere near as interesting, because they tend to be simply the constitution of the club, which is the same every year, and a list of club runs that the various sections were doing. So they don't tend to have a lot of interesting information. They did at the time. In 1912, it was interesting for 1912. But these, if you see any of these, they are worth buying because they're a good read. They're not worth paying a lot for. Sheffield Clarion Ramblers were one of the chief organisers of the public access campaign to get access to the Dark Peak in the Peak District. In 1907, Bert Ward led a mass trespass of Bleak Low. That was a forerunner of the Kinder trespass. On the day of the Kinder trespass, We all know about Benny Rothman and the people having the fight with the gamekeepers going up from Edale, not from Edale, from Hayfield, going up from Hayfield, fighting with the gamekeepers, ended up in prison. We all know about that. But on that day, the Sheffield Clarion Ramblers were also climbing up Kinderscout from the other side. The idea was they would meet at the top. And Benny Rothman, in fact, he was the leader of the Kinder Trespass. He was a Clarion cyclist from Manchester and a Clarion Rambler from Manchester. The Sheffield Clarion Ramblers kept going until, I think, 2007, when they folded. And I find it quite remarkable that an organisation so good actually folded. And he produces handbook for over 50 years, every year. There were other large nationwide Clarion organisations. Clarion Handicraft Guild, the Clarion Handicraft Guild, and Clarion Vocal Unions, and Cinderella Clubs. The Handicraft Guild motto was joy in work, hope in leisure. Their aim was to encourage members to participate in art, jewellery making, pottery, bookbinding, furniture making. The Clarion Handicraft Guild made this Clarion van, which was designed by Walter Crane, very famous art and crafts movement artist. And it was dedicated to Caroline Martin, who died at the age of 29 in Dundee. And that was built by the Handicraft Guild. That was a picture taken in Shrewsbury, at the Shrewsbury plant. The Cinderella Club, I have a picture of Cinderella Club, that's right. The Cinderella Club, these weren't started by the Cycling Club, they were started by Robert Blatchford, who encouraged like-minded readers to form groups that would provide food and entertainment for children forced by the evils of capitalism to endure terrible conditions at home and in the workplace. The Clarion quickly embraced this idea. In 1913, the handbook states, the central idea of the Cinderella Clubs is to subject all slum children to a severe course of dolls, toys, skipping ropes and other amusements, and to feed them so they may enjoy the pleasures the better. If the Clarion Cycling Club exists for no other object than riding about the country, there is little justification in their being and none for their name. So the Clarion Cycling Club, again, being squarely a political organisation. The Clarion Vocal Unions, I think I might have a picture of a vocal union, because the man in the centre has the bass on. They were formed by Robert Blatchford's brother Montague in 1894 to develop the art of unaccompanied singing, to aid propaganda by singing at meetings. So these people sing a whole variety of songs, but at political meetings they would sing socialist songs. The first Clarion Sunday took place at a place called Bolton Wood near Bradford, and 100 singers attended. The following year, 2,000 people gathered at Ardcastle Craigs for Clarion Sunday. There was 400 singers, and the rest were Clarion cyclists who turned up to support the singers. Keir Hardy was there, and this is a picture, and Caroline Martin was there as the main speaker. And they preached socialism. And the local newspaper said this: from a days like heath-clad rock around which the quiet choristers stood, arose our Caroline Martin. No Diana of old was ever more godlike than she. She spoke words of burning fervour and truth. She spoke as no woman had ever spoken in my hearing before. Scales fell from my eyes, and afore long I was a socialist. So that's what Caroline Martin was doing. There were many other Clarion organisations. I think we have a picture of a football team, Clarion football team, and I think we have a Clarion swimming team as well. The Clarion football team, their motto was footballs, not cannonballs. And just going back to Clarion choirs, we've now restarted Clarion Sunday, but we're now doing it up at Clarion House because there's no political advantage for us to do it at Ardcastle Craigs. Doing it at Clarion House, it brings money to Clarion House and keeps that haven of socialism going. The Clarion choirs also competed for a baton. The conductor was an ivory baton, and they had an annual choir competition. And they had it in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, where the choirs would compete, and the winning choir got this ivory baton, which sadly has been lost. There are also Clarion camera clubs, Clarion drama clubs, the Clarion fellowship for those who have no interest in sport or leisure, but simply wanted to meet up socially and share socialist ideas. And the badges are actually quite rare. You see them sometimes in antique shops. They're the same Clarion badge, but they've got a big red letter C in the middle. And that's the badge of the Clarion Fellowship. After the Great Imperialist War, socialists involved in sport were determined workers would never again kill each other in the name of nationalism, and the slogan, "Peace through sport," was born. The aim being to use sporting instincts of workers as a means of breaking down international prejudices. However, the Olympic Games were seen by people on the left, and still are, as bourgeois, chauvinistic, elitist and nationalistic. And this led to the formation of the Workers' Olympiads. The Workers' Olympiads were bigger and had a bigger attendance and more athletes than the official Olympic Games. Needless to say, the Clarion Cycle Clubs as socialist organisations participated in the Workers' Olympiads and were most successful in the cycling events, not surprisingly. These games differed in 3 ways from the official Olympics. The official Olympics encouraged competition along nationalist lines. They still do. Whereas the Olympiads stressed internationalism, solidarity and peace. The International Olympic Committee barred the losing nations from the war participating in the 1920 and 1924 Games, whereas the first Olympiad was held in Germany, in Germany. Secondly, the official Olympics restricted entry on grounds of sporting ability. The Workers' Olympics invited all comers. The accent was on participation. If you wanted to run or ride, you could come to the Olympics and run and ride. It's about participating. The second Olympiad in Vienna, 80,000 athletes from 23 countries paraded through the streets. They did not parade under national banners. They held a board up saying they were England or France or Germany, but they all paraded under the red flag of socialism. There was no Union Jacks or national flags. Thirdly, the Olympic Games were criticised for being for the sons of the rich and through their amateur rules and their sexism. The founder of the Olympic Games did not believe women should be allowed to compete in the Olympic Games. It seemed to be undignified. They were meant to be for men, and because of the amateur rules, it made them very, very exclusive. It virtually barred working men from participating because of the amateurish rules. The Workers' Olympiads were explicitly against all chauvinism, racism, sexism, and they were socially inclusive, not exclusive. They were there to demonstrate the fundamental unity of all working people, irrespective of their colour, their class, or their national origins. Clarion teams were represented in Frankfurt at the Olympiad and Vienna, where a man called Colin Copeland from Oldham won the gold medal in the cycling, and Tommy Hurst from Blackburn, where I bought my first bicycle. Might have a picture of his bike shop somewhere, near Blackburn Infirmary. That's where I bought my first bicycle. Tommy Hurst, he won a bronze medal in the Olympiad in Vienna. A team of 5 Clarion cyclists were due in Barcelona in 1936 for the 3rd Olympiad, but the day the Games were due to start, the fascists, aided by Britain, launched the Civil War, and the Games were actually had to be abandoned the very day they were due to start. A number of Clarion cyclists fought in the ranks of the International Brigade, trying to defend democracy in Spain, and 5 of them still lie in the soil of Spain today in unmarked graves. Ray Cox, Tom Dolan, Tom Aldershaw, Roy Watts and Harold Lawrence, and we still honour those people every year, and a plaque honours them at Clarion House. What about the Clarion today? In fact, we might have a picture of the, that's the banner of Clarion cyclist Ray Watts. He went out before the International Brigades were formed, and he joined a unit called the Tom Man Centuria. And then, when the International Brigades were formed, the Tom Man Centuria joined the German Thalmann Brigade, because the British Brigade hadn't been formed. They joined the Thalmann Brigade, and Ray Watts was one of the first people to die at the defence of Madrid. So we honour him every year. And our club colours are the clubs of the Spanish Republican flag. So what about the Clarion Cycling Club today? Well, the National Clarion Cycling Club still exists. It's no longer a political organisation, although until last year its constitution did contain a commitment to socialism. In recent times it's advertised itself as the online social networking bike club. Don't know why, but it has. Their club is thriving, I have to say that. They've got 2,000 members, they have 30 different sections. They still maintain the tradition of Oldham and Easter meet, and they organise their own national championship of races, which attract usually about 6 or 7 riders. The much smaller National Clarion Cycling Club, 1895, because we honour the principles of the founders. We are committed to cycling, combining cycling and socialism. We're a campaign organisation. We have close links with the Labour and Trade Union movement and with the International Brigade Memorial Trust. Our marching band, as I said, is dedicated to Ray Cox. He was Secretary of the Southern Counties Clarion Union and died at Madrid. 8 years ago, 10 of our members cycled from London to the Lenin Barracks in Barcelona. And what we were doing, we were reacting a route that Tom Aldershaw had done. Tom Aldershaw came from Clapham, he was at the joinery in Clapham, and he cycled to Spain, to Barcelona, to enrol, to fight, and he was killed at Caspe at age 24 on the Aragon front. There are still a number of active Clarion choirs, and that number is growing, which I'm pleased to say. Birmingham Clarion was one of the first to re-emerge, and it was formed by a member who came back from the Spanish Civil War. And what he found in the Spanish Civil War was when the Spanish soldiers were in difficulties and things were looking a bit grim, they raised their spirits by singing. So he came back determined to carry on this tradition, and he started Birmingham Clarion Choir. There's a Clarion Choir, East Lakes Clarion Choir in Burnley. There's Bolton Wood Street Clarion Choir, obviously in Bolton. These choirs are politically active choirs. They sing at political demonstrations, they go on political demonstrations, they are politically active choirs. And they will be attending the Clarion Sunday on the 12th of June this year. So if you're free on the 12th of June, come up to Clarion House. You don't need to have a bicycle, but you'll be able to hear the choirs singing there. The best way to understand the Clarion movement today is to visit that haven of socialism, the ILP Clarion House at Nelson. And that's a picture of it. It's open every Sunday from 10 o'clock till 4. It sells pint pots of Clarion tea for 60 pence. Something Starbucks should be ashamed of. It uses real tea leaves on these fancy middle class tea bags. And if you ask, you can have the tea leaves in your cup and take a fortune as well if you like. But we do normally strain the tea. Clarion House at Rough Lea, which is now the last one in the country in actual fact, it was not built by the Clarion Cycling Club. It was built by members of the Independent Labour Party living in Nelson. At the turn of last century, Nelson Independent Labour Party was the second biggest in the country. And they determined they would copy what the Clarion Cycling Club was doing. They would have a place out of town in the country where they could go on a Sunday. And what they did initially They set up a company, the Nelson Independent Labour Party Land Society, to sell shares, and they initially rented a small cottage in Thornhill Square, which is between Rutley and Ball. And they rented this cottage. It's still there today, number 1 Thornhill Square, still there today. Should have a blue plaque on it, but it hasn't, but it should have. And that was the first Nelson Clarion clubhouse. They left there because it was too small. It's a very tiny little cottage. They were getting over 200 people coming every Sunday. It couldn't cope. So they then rented a farm, which is now a very, very nice private house. It's in a field opposite the existing Clarion house, a place called Nab Farm. They rented this farm, but the farm was very, very dilapidated and needed a heck of a lot of work doing. So in 1912, they borrowed money from the Weavers' Union, bought a piece of land and purpose-built this place, this small bungalow. The initial plan was actually to have a dormitory as well, but that never materialised. They built this small bungalow, it opened in 1912, it's been there ever since, and it really is a haven to socialism. And I thoroughly recommend that you come on a Sunday, particularly on Clarion Sunday. It's staffed by volunteers, it's a really great place inside. It does sell things like crisps and Kit Kats, and it does sell Nestle stuff. It shouldn't, but it does sell Nestle stuff. Sells tea and coffee very cheaply. You're invited to bring your own sandwiches, your own cake. There are big long tables, so you can't sit in isolation talking on your mobile phone. You have to sit with other people and socialise, and that's what it's all about. There's always a good roaring fire, and there's always gallons of tea, so you must come. I'll conclude by just reading a letter that appeared in Boots and Spurs. Boots and Spurs is the name of the National Clarion Cycling Club magazine. And this letter appeared in 1960, written by a member called James Straker. Our origins was based on a new way of life, not merely on the pleasures of cycling. The Clarion helped to make history. In days when the working classes were overworked, underpaid and underprivileged, Clarion men and women were at the forefront of those who expounded theories of a new way of life and helped to bring about the material benefits we enjoy today. I think we should reiterate and stand fast by our origins. Then for some at least, socialism and cycling will remain the hope of the world. And that is what we in Clarion 8.5 still believe today. So, thank you for your attention. If there's any really easy questions, I'll attempt to ask them. Tell about asking me the capitals of foreign obscure countries that didn't used to exist. I don't know. A little bit of propaganda as well. I have to have a bit of propaganda. There's some free postcards here which people can take to remind you where you should be going on Sunday. You have the Socialist 10 Commandments on the back. These are the original ones, not the ones Sarah Reddish amended, unfortunately. I don't like them. But have one of those, they're free. It's like being a magician, isn't it? On the 5th of June, there's going to be a walk from here. We're restarting that this year. We're going to make an annual event. It's a Socialist Sunday School Whit walk. It's going to walk from here to Clarion House. It will be led not by me, by an expert walk leader called Nick Burton. It's about 3 miles from here to Clarion House. It's the route that people in the Socialist Sunday School here traditionally have taken up to Clarion House. So everyone is invited, bring your own tea. Need to put some stout shoes on because the first part's on the pavement, but it can be a bit muddy later on.
Can you not do it barefoot if you want?
Sorry?
Can you not do it barefoot?
You can if you wish. You can if you wish. And on the back, it's double-sided. It's in colour. It's double-sided as well. On the back, there's an invite to Clarion Sunday. You don't need a bike, but if you have a bike, please come on it. There's also, if you want to know more about the Clarion, there's also some books here. This The title is a bit deceptive, the story of the National Clarion Cycling Club, a bit deceptive that. It tells you about Clarion houses, tells you about the newspaper, far better than I've told you, tells you about the clubhouses, tells you about the Workers' Olympiads. It's a really, really good book. It should be £7.50, but because our club is a generous club, they're only £5. If anybody wants a Clarion badge, we have lots of badges. We have patches, which are £3, which you stitch on. We have badges commemorating our members who fell in the Civil War in Spain. And we have Clarion trumpet badges, which are the badges and the patches are £3 a piece. So if you want any of those, come and help yourself. Please do come to Clarion House, and please try and come to Clarion Sunday. Thank you to the projectionist, thank you to Gary for letting us see. Please,